And now it's time for our first after-lunch talk. If you've been to PyCon and given a talk or volunteered, you've probably met our next presenter. She's here to tell us about how to read journal articles. Please welcome Julia Duimovich.
Hey everyone, I'm really excited to be here. Thank you all for coming back from lunch on time. The last time I gave this talk, I was against lunch, so this is nicer and just much better overall. Although, you know, lunch is good too. So this talk is about reading journal articles. It is a little bit just about learning things in general, but yeah, in general, I'm focusing on journal articles. This is a difficult thing. Reading technical papers is technical. Reading them in your second language is a lot harder. So if you are not a native English speaker, huge kudos if you struggle through any of these papers, or any papers in general. It's hard for the native English speakers in the room, so congratulations. So a couple years ago, at some point during my undergrad, this is my vague thought of how reading a paper worked. You would read one, there would be a step 2, and then somehow that would gain you some awesome skills, intelligence, kudos of some kind. Not how that works, though. You have to understand what step 2 is. And now you may say to me, but that's a terrible idea. They are miserable, boring, and written by people who have senses of self-importance that are slightly overly large. But they're so useful. But agreed, there is inaccessible language. They're sometimes expensive, especially if you don't want to break the law and use open access papers that have been uploaded. They are useful for academics, but not for software engineers, is a thing that I've been told a lot. And they're also all in PDFs. And a reminder here, PDFs were invented in 1993, which is the year of my birth. So I don't understand why we're still on this format. I still think it's worth it. Here's why. You can lean on somebody else's foundational knowledge. Somebody else had to get a PhD, or maybe they didn't have to get one, but they got pretty close, and then they wrote a paper. And that PhD is these building blocks. So you can stand on top of that tower and just enjoy the view. It's very convenient. Partially that's just because someone has to do a literature review, so you don't have to read all of these papers. They've read them for you, and then they know what's important. That's very nice. And it's also useful to direct you about what to learn next. So sometimes in a new field, you have no idea what's interesting, what's relevant. You just have sort of a vague idea that you want to learn more about cryptocurrency, and you're like, where do I go from here? If you read cryptocurrency papers, you will find other papers to sort of direct you and be able to pick up new understanding that way. So that's good. Another thing that's great is that you can practice reasoning about new concepts and patterns. This is more interesting when you do this a lot with like black boxes at work. If you have to figure out how something works when you're onboarding or something like that, if you've practiced a lot with journal articles and thinking about how somebody has vaguely described a system, you can apply your knowledge much more effectively to things that you have to do in real life. You can practice designing experiments. So a lot of us write code and then we kind of vaguely go, this is going to be more performant, right? If you can't think of how to test and assume and prove that that this is the faster way or this other way is better, then you're not really actually able to talk about that you know that something is faster. And so if you read a lot of papers, people will talk about how they did an experiment on this software or how they discovered something about it. And you can sort of build on that knowledge. Another great thing, which I think is so useful and that we desperately need more of in this industry, is to be able to tell when someone has no freaking idea what they're talking about. So please, reading something that you have no idea what you're talking about with, which is generally what happens when I read a technical paper, means that I have to sort of vaguely try to understand what they're talking about and really grasp subtleties of technical points that I don't understand. And then that's really great because I can listen to someone's elevator speech about cryptocurrency. I'm going to make fun of cryptocurrency a lot in this talk, vaguely. And understand that they are mostly full of crap. And it's much better to be able to do that in the elevator than after you've put a bunch of money into the elevator. So that's useful. So my initial strategy, which again harkens back to step 2 was to just read these papers. It turns out that doesn't really work. It's not very effective, and you are going to have a bad time. It was a huge waste of my time. I vaguely remember reading a blog post that I read in first year, and I read it, and I was like, okay, I'm in first year, I should read things. I'm in university, I should learn more things that are not just learning the schoolwork. And I read it, and then I read it the same thing like a year or 2 later. And I was like, oh, now I understand all these words and what this actual blog post says. And that's just a blog post. So if you just read something and you don't actually engage with it, you are going to be miserable at the end of time. So that was unfortunate. As I moved on and I moved through my undergrad, I started reading more docs. I would look at an API and go, how do I use this? And docs are more technical than blog posts, but maybe less so than a technical paper. And I would still get stuck. I would have to really force myself not to skim. I would have to really engage with what the precise notation was. Some of us have read docs before, and you're looking at the function call descriptor, and it has optional parameters, and you're like, what do those brackets mean? I don't understand why more brackets and more brackets and more brackets are occurring. Turns out notation matters, and understanding what it means that you will get more out of what you're learning. So this is Bloom's taxonomy. If you've ever gone to teachers college, they have beat this over your head a couple times. It's not the most useful thing in the world. It is more useful when you are engaging with writing a test and trying to decide how to evaluate the level of knowledge that somebody has based on what kind of questions you're asking. So as you go higher up the pyramid, you get more interesting sort of questions that you can ask and things that you can accomplish if you have that knowledge. So this is where I was reading. Not great. We're at the bottom. Vaguely, I would sometimes not even understand enough to remember, which is not great. And this is where we want to be. And so when you are doing this kind of learning, focused on your own intentionally, self-evaluation and self-reflection of what part of the taxonomy that you're sort of at and how you can engage is very useful. Because we are developers. We want to be able to create things. That's what writing code is. We want to be able to evaluate other people's opinions. That's what being in an architecture meeting literally is. And we want to be able to analyze data and think about it and take information out of it. So as I said, I made a bunch of mistakes. Mistake number 1, I ignored and did not really read or engage with code samples or diagrams. Don't do this. It's literally there to give you information that they couldn't figure out how to write down in words. It is literally the point of the text is to accompany the diagrams. If you don't read them, if you do not read the code sample and try to understand the point that they're making, you are wasting your time. Don't be me. Another thing that I was doing was having no context, nothing at all. I would read something like a cryptocurrency paper, maybe not a cryptocurrency paper, maybe even just a paper on like a new computer architecture. I don't know why I was reading these things. First year university, you don't need to know these things yet. It's okay to just be less ambitious. Start with stuff that you actually have some hope of understanding. Mistake number 3. I would read stuff, and I would sort of be doing something else at the same time. This is a waste of your time. I promise you, pay attention to things. Pay attention to things as much as you can when you are trying to get as much out of it as you can. Otherwise, you will vaguely see words, you will vaguely see pictures, and you will not really remember them. And then my final mistake was thinking that not understanding this stuff meant that I should not be in tech. Nope, I'm still here. It's still fine. Everything is good. I'm a developer now, guys. It all worked out. Just because I can't read a paper or couldn't read a paper 5 years ago does not mean that I should leave. Don't do this. It's okay not to understand things. I believe yesterday Guido said that he doesn't understand things on stage, in public. Guys, people don't understand things. What a rocket scientist concept here. It's fine. So a little bit of notes on how a paper fits together. Sometimes they have bits that aren't in this, and sometimes they do have all of this, and it just depends on the paper. But in general, there will always be an abstract, which is essentially a 1 sentence per chunk of the paper shoved into 1 paragraph instead. This is the most useful thing to read before you decide how much time you're going to spend on it. If you read the abstract and you don't want to engage with the paper, you can turn around. They'll talk about design and methods sometimes, which is useful to sort of understand how they decided what they've decided with this conclusion of their paper. There'll be a discussion which talks about why they might be wrong and how they're hopefully not wrong, but this is how they tried to avoid it. And then there'll be a conclusion which tells you your opinion that you should take away from this paper. Sometimes you might disagree with that opinion if you read the paper and you actually disagree with them, which is useful. So before you get started, you got to do some things for preparation. So I like to schedule time in my actual calendar. Sometimes I do this at work because sometimes I'm reading something that's relevant to my job. And turns out that we're allowed to learn things for our jobs and schedule time to do that. So this is nice. Put it in your calendar. There's nothing else going to be happening during that time. You're going to go and you're going to do it, and it's going to happen. You might want to grab some supplies. I am an old-fashioned notebook person. I have a notebook. I write stuff down in it. At some point, the notebook gets full, and I throw it away, and I get a new notebook. And then I use that as my brain for the next 6 months. Highlighters, I don't know. I like them. You can draw things, but they don't erase the colors on you can draw over text and still see underneath. Before you commit to reading a paper, be interested, be engaged, care. It is way harder to, read a crypto paper than to read a paper that you actually want to read. I'm so sorry. If anyone here is in crypto, I'm not going to get any nicer about it. So reading this paper, to actually engage, you should read the abstract. This is the abstract of a paper that I read so that I could say things and have opinions about reading papers on a stage. Don't read it. It's very long. I will highlight some things. But a quick summary of the paper so that you know what I'm talking about is that this paper took memory dumps and they reverse engineered what the state of the program was before each instruction and reverse debugged it to try to get debugging tools to be useful. So it's mostly a talk about using mostly a paper about using tools in production that are lightweight so that you can reverse debug difficult to debug crashes. Okay, so first thing that I would like to point out is that I had no idea what a memory dump was. Good start. So I Googled that. That happened. Didn't really know what was going to be in one. Turns out the state of a bunch of different addresses, the code that was running in it, various other information that you don't care about. There is a point where I was like, what is forwards and backwards execution? Well, forwards execution is what the computer does when it's running the code. Okay, we know what that is. It's just executing instructions line by line. Backwards execution is doing that backwards. So, again, this felt more confusing than it should have been, just because of the phrase. Hardware tracing. What is hardware tracing? I did not know. Turns out they just turned some instructions on in the processor to put some timing information into the dumps so that they would have ideas about multi-threading. Cool. And information loss and concurrent execution. I just sort of vaguely don't do multiprocessing because I'm a web developer, so I definitely got an eyebrow there from Sam in the front row. I'm sure there'll be an interesting tweet after this. Yeah, so again, I didn't know what it was. Definitely had to go look into more why it would affect how we could reverse debug various states of the program. So I wrote those questions down because how could I figure out what was confusing me when I read the paper unless I had these cues to sort of guide me in how I was reading? We've all done reading comprehension tests in school. They literally ask you questions about a text that you've just read. The real trick that I did not learn until after taking one of these tests was that you read the questions first, and then you read the paper, or the piece of paper. So this applies for literally everything. You could do this in any context. It doesn't have to be reading comprehension tests. So after you read the abstract, you should take a pause. Yesterday, Paloma mentioned a bunch of failure, and that her goal was failure and to fail a lot. I just want to point out that stopping at the end of this is not failure. If you stop at the end of the abstract, it's okay. It is completely allowed to stop. if you had read the abstract that I had just put up and you said, what the hell is that? Run away, it's fine. Come back in a couple years, come back in a couple months. It's okay, pick something else. So now you're committed to reading this paper. You're stuck. You've said, I'm gonna do it. You've put it in your calendar. You're sitting down. You have a hot beverage. Maybe you've printed out the entire thing. It's 17 pages. 18 of those are references to other papers. I'm just kidding, only 5, but still, it feels like a lot when you read all of them. Put on your good student hat. You are going to be Hermione, you are going to be amazing, you are going to be the best student you have ever seen yourself be. We've all been lazy students, but you're doing this for yourself, so be as good as you can be in the moment. If it means that you are busy and you don't have time for this, don't try to half-ass it. It's just not gonna work for you. I would like to point out that Hermione did stuff like background reading for fun, making lateral connections. She would be in herbology and pointing out that potions had a relevant topic that we could all sort of learn from. And who does that? Good students. Cool, thanks. And she was also prepared in advance. So focusing on what you can do to get yourself ready to read this paper. Do you not know a piece of information that you might want to know? Go and do the reading about it beforehand. Go and write some code that might explore that topic for yourself. You're reading the paper, you don't understand how something fits together, you should write some notes, you should write some diagrams, you should draw stuff out, you should maybe write some code that might explain to you how everything works. And you should Google stuff. So I Googled a bunch of things. Again, I don't generally work with low level of code. I'm mostly writing in Python. I don't look at instructions very often. And so I had to go Google what a bunch of stuff meant, like what the precise notation of adding 2 numbers together in a memory, like in an instruction set, looked like. What were you actually going to do? Where did the value get stored? Didn't know. I also Googled, as I said earlier, what's a memory dump? Now, some of you work in lower level code, and you know what this is, so this would have been a really approachable paper for you, and that's okay too. And I highly recommend stepping through the diagrams, like really stepping through. So here's a diagram. You're all looking at it like, cool, thanks. This was not supposed to be a talk where we look at very intense, precise code. So this is the direction where you are doing backwards execution, where you trace up the diagram. And this is the direction where you're going forwards. There's really just 3 instructions in this set, and then in each column they have the memory values in those registers at any given point. And so in the bottom of column 1, so in iteration 1, RAX equals 3 and RBX equals 0, that's what the memory dump told us, so we know that. So tracing through this and going, how did they get to the point where we actually know what the values were at the beginning? You actually have to read it. So I will briefly illustrate that if you look at the next line, we know now that some of the values do not just automatically tell you that we know them in the current version, but a step backwards, we don't automatically know. And so the question marks illustrate this nicely. So here we lose what RBX is, because how can we understand that from the previous line? And then we lose both values. Oh no, this is worse. We're going backwards and we're getting more confused. But turns out that moving a set value into RBX makes it much easier to tell that value number 1 is in RBX. OK, now we can move forward and say that this makes more sense. So you can see that, like, stepping through it and going, how did they get the question mark, and then not having the question mark, and tracing it, much more useful. Another piece of advice is to pretend like you're editing the paper. You can be a little snarky. My inner voice is snarky. You all can tell this from the way that I act and speak at all times. So you can circle things. You can pretend to be that teacher with a red pen that says, what the heck does this mean? This explanation should be earlier in the text. Like, how could you lead me on through this diagram that was so horrible and unhelpful? You can really get your catharsis out. And then at the end, you have to take something out of this. You can't have gone through it, suffered through inner snark, learned so many things about crypto, without actually trying to connect that. So the Hermione lateral connections thing this is the step. So you want to reread your notes. You want to think about how this applies in your real life. Could you use some of these techniques in a more useful setting at work? Could you use citations to connect to additional topics in the sort of circle of adjacent concepts? The web there sort of indicates that sometimes the paper that you've read will be cited by other papers, and then this paper will also cite other papers. So there's a two-way connection. You can go in both directions, more or less. You should also pat yourself on the back, have a cookie. You did some work. It was hard. Now, here are a couple of resources. I was complaining earlier about PDFs. There are a bunch of tablets that are specifically designed for people to use PDFs and just read them, which is so much nicer than reading one on your phone, or even sometimes like a small Kindle. Doesn't really, not great. So Remarkable Tablet is super nice for that, but super pricey. The Morning Paper is a blog where the guy just reads a paper every day and then makes comments about it on his blog, which is nice because if you're me and you don't want to read the paper, you can just read the blog, or you can read both and sort of make connections with how that person is analyzing it and sort of how that person step through with you and hold your hand a bit. The ACM has Best Paper Awards. Good space to start if you're like, I want to learn something about this specific topic. They do them bunched by topic, so you can look at specifically software engineering papers, or specifically crypto papers, or machine learning papers, and go, I want this thing. What's the best topic from this year for this paper? There is a paper thread. Halelogram is a prolific tweeter about lots of interesting things, but he does read papers a lot, and so this is a thread that he wrote on engaging with them. And finally, deep work. I guess we're in the Bay Area. Lots of people have opinions about Cal Newport, I'm sure, but he writes things about thinking really hard and then having good things come out of that. So you should definitely engage with that if that's sort of an interesting thing for you. And yeah, so that's about it. Thank you so much, everyone.